Now I'll move forward into Part 1 of Module 8, Intensifying Behavioral Interventions. Part 1 will focus on the question, how do we intensify supports for small groups of students? First, we'll ground ourselves in the prevention logic for all, focusing on the redesign of teaching environments, not students. Again, this reiterates a big theme across these 8 modules, where we're focusing on establishing a preventative and proactive learning environment for all of our learners. Again, reestablishing the environment. The focus is there rather than on changing the student themselves. First, our prevention objectives. We're looking to decrease the development of new problem behaviors. In other words, looking to decrease the incidence of challenging behaviors, while also preventing the worsening of behaviors and reduce the intensity of existing problem behaviors. So globally, we're looking to reduce the incidence as well as the prevalence of what we're currently observing in some of our students. So what are our prevention actions? Well, first, we're looking to eliminate triggers and maintainers of problem behaviors. We're also looking to add triggers and maintainers, in other words, antecedent strategies and consequence strategies, to maintain pro-social or appropriate behaviors. Finally, we're looking to identify behavior support strategies where we're going to teach, monitor, and acknowledge students when they exhibit pro-social, appropriate classroom behaviors. In using this prevention logic, we also segue into a conversation about a very familiar graphic that you've likely seen before: the 3-tiered preventative approach to respond to students' challenging behaviors and preventively support those behaviors in and around the classroom, as well as the entire school. As a systems change approach, the green tier encompasses all learners across all environments of the school-wide structure. Through the first 7 modules, as we discuss the 5 evidence-based classroom management structures, we are talking globally. We are talking about supporting all learners' behavior, social, and emotional needs in and around your classroom. As previously discussed in the intro to this module, when done well and with integrity, over time, we'll be confident in saying that we're supporting approximately, theoretically, 80% of our learners' behavioral needs. What about the other 20%? As this system is additive in nature, students who are at risk or high risk for behavioral challenges will always continue to receive all the supports available at the Tier 1 structure. However, those students might need systematically more intensive supports. In the green piece of the triangle, known as Tier 2, we're looking to support a specialized group of learners who have demonstrated at-risk challenging behaviors and may benefit from systematically more intensive behavioral supports. Theoretically, this supports 15% of our student body's behavioral needs. And finally, the tertiary level of this 3-tiered framework supports our highest risk population, the students who continually exhibit chronic, high-level major behavior violations and would benefit from the deepest dive behavior support we can possibly do in and around the school building. This supports 1 to 5% of our student population, and these are known as tertiary level behavioral supports. For now, let's focus our conversation on secondary supports, or Tier 2 supports. So who benefits? Students who continue to demonstrate challenging behavior despite school and classroom-wide supports being in place may benefit from Tier 2 supports. As previously mentioned, we're talking about approximately 10 to 15% of your student population who may benefit from these level of supports. Tier 2 supports support students who are likely to be students with both academic and behavioral difficulties. As we know, in and around the country, students oftentimes have parallel challenges. They demonstrate behavior, social, and emotional challenges parallel to academic challenges. So keep in mind, at the Tier 2 level, we might be providing support to students both from a behavioral standpoint as well as an academic standpoint. Without effective school-wide prevention in place, we cannot reliably identify students who benefit from secondary supports. This is critical to keep in mind. As we focused on through the previous 7 modules, we've talked at length about identifying comprehensive class-wide behavioral supports. This is the same concept. At a school-wide level, we always look to have at least 80% implementation fidelity of school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports before we can adequately identify and reliably support students at the Tier 2 and/or Tier 3 levels. Now let's look at some common elements of Tier 2 practices. First, Tier 2 supports should be consistent and standardized in their implementation across students. Tier 2 support should also be easily accessible. In other words, we're looking for students who have been identified to potentially need Tier 2 supports to then receive those supports within a few days of that referral being received. Tier 2 support should be continuously available and implemented by all school staff. All school staff should have a clear understanding of what Tier 2 supports are available and which students are receiving those supports. Next, all Tier 2 practices should be consistent with and extra doses of school-wide expectations and interventions. As mentioned on the triangle slide previously, the three-tiered, multi-tiered behavioral framework is, in essence, an additive system. What this bullet point is driving home here is the idea that as students progress up this framework, up these three tiers, they are continually receiving the supports that were provided at the previous tier. Next, at the Tier 2 level, we're looking to target and provide explicit skills instruction for our learners. And we're looking to scale up the level of acknowledgments the students receive for exhibiting appropriate behaviors. Also through Tier 2 supports, this goes hand in hand, we're providing increased adult support and providing more frequent performance feedback for targeted behaviors. There are also plans in place for the student to be able to generalize and maintain their developed more appropriate behaviors over time and across contexts of their learning environment, across their school. And all of these can be cited in the Crone, Hawken, and Horner article of 2010. You may be familiar with the taxonomy of intervention intensity items listed here on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are familiar with that content, big idea, what we're talking about here as we progress a student from a Tier 1 to a Tier 2 support is increasing the strength of that intervention, the dosage of that intervention, and we're, of course, focusing on the alignment of the intervention to the Tier 1 school-wide or class-wide supports that they've already been exposed to. You may recognize this slide from previous modules. Here we're looking at our positive class-wide behavior support practices decision-making guide with 3 key questions. We've discussed and looked at these questions over the previous 7 modules and will continue to do so through our conversation in this Module 8. The first question was, are the foundations of effective positive class-wide behavior supports in place? From there, we discussed our proactive and positive practices implemented consistently. Then we looked at, do data indicate that students are still engaging in problem behavior? As a review, you've likely seen this flowchart before as well. If the students are still engaging in problem behavior, you're going to want to ask yourself if those behaviors are minor or major. If students are not engaging in problem behaviors, success, and it should be celebrated. You're doing a great job. You should continue to monitor the outcomes in your classroom. For our conversations here, as we continue to have a conversation about scaling up our behavioral support for at-risk and high-risk learners, we're going to be talking about this part of the flowchart. Are behaviors minor or major expectation violations in nature? If they're minor, in Module 5 we discussed using brief, specific error corrections and other strategies. If they're major, the question we want to ask ourselves is it many students or a few students that are exhibiting these major behaviors? If many students are exhibiting major behavior violations, you're going to want to self-reflect and revisit with colleagues in your classroom what class-wide support structures are in place and which of those can be improved. If you only have a few students exhibiting major behavior violations, you're likely going to look to refer those students to a Tier 2 or to a Tier 3 structure. For now, let's look at Tier 2. You should ask yourself, is there a targeted group of students displaying frequent but minor challenging behaviors? If the answer to that question is yes, you may look to invest in Tier 2 supports for the identified target group in your classroom. There is a growing list of evidence-based Tier 2 supports for you to select from. Again, keeping in mind what the underlying function of the group of students' challenging behaviors is. We'll be discussing this first one at length, check-in, check-out procedures. There's also check-in, check and connect, check, connect, and expect. There are social skills groups you might look to identify for Tier 2 supports, as well as the class-wide fit model. As we move forward through this module, Dr. Freeman will take over and discuss this part of the flowchart. Are there individual students displaying chronic or high-intensity problem behaviors? If the answer is yes, you're going to look to invest in Tier 3 supports for the identified individual students. Through this process, as will be discussed, you'll be looking at individualized function-based supports through the conduction of a functional behavioral assessment, or an FBA, to develop a behavior support plan, or BSP. This is a coordinated plan via wraparound procedures. For now, let's focus our conversation on Tier 2. So you have a targeted group identified. You want to invest in Tier 2 supports. Let's first look at a very common Tier 2 support known as check-in, check-out. Through this module, we will not have the time to go into a deep conversation around the check-in, check-out procedures. We won't be talking at length about how a student comes into the process, how you monitor the process, and adapt the process over time. Well, that would require quite a bit more dialogue. What we will do is identify, generally speaking, what check-in, check-out looks like before moving into a conversation about other Tier 2 behavioral support options. So the daily check-in, check-out, CICO cycle. This model is based off of a student receiving more frequent feedback from a positive adult throughout the school day. It ingrains a homeschool connection and encourages students to work towards an individualized point goal each school day. Once brought into the system, the student will begin each day by picking up a point sheet. The point sheet may look something like this. What you'll notice on this point sheet is a few key takeaways. First, on the left-hand side, you'll see a direct connection to the school-wide positive behavior support expectations. At the class-wide level, because the check-in, check-out system can also be implemented class-wide if you do not have a school-wide structure in place, you would want to certainly put your class-wide behavior expectations in this column. Along the top row, what you'll see are the different routines from across the day. You would fill in these boxes in your classroom depending on the schedule that your students see each day with you. Within each box, you then have a point structure. Depending on the age and the context of your students, you can adjust the point structure to meet your needs. In this example, we have a simple 0, 1, 2 point structure. So, student comes in the morning to a check-in station or check-in room. They pick up their point sheet and have a positive adult contact. There will be an adult there in the check-in room, greeting the student, ensuring the student has all the materials they need for that day, giving them a fresh point sheet for that day, identifying what the student's individualized point goal is for that day before sending them off for their academic school day. Once the student has picked up their point sheet and materials, they carry the point sheet with them throughout their day. Now, for a middle or high school age student, that would physically mean taking this point sheet with them from one period to the next. For an elementary level student, that would likely mean the student would keep the point sheet at their desk throughout the day and would check in with the general classroom teacher throughout the day at set points in time. Throughout the day, as demonstrated here, at the end of each routine or period of the day, the teacher checks in with the student, identifying how many points the student earned for that period of time. At the end of the day, the student takes their completed point sheet back to the checkout room, again greeted by the positive adult. Returning the point sheet, they also get a copy to take home with them. The positive adult contact checks in with the student. If the student achieved their daily point goal, again, each point goal being individualized based on that learner's previous achievement, they will receive and exchange those points for a reinforcer. Over time, if you recall from previous modules, we talked about a token economy. The check-in, check-out system is established on a platform of a token economy. In essence, if the student has earned their daily point goal, they will exchange this point sheet for a token in this system, and over time they can build up these tokens for backup reinforcers. In addition, at the end of the day, the student gets the point sheet to take home. They take the copy of the completed point sheet home for a check-in with guardian, mom, or dad. The parent provides positive adult contact at home, reflects with the student on how their school day went, signs off on the point sheet for it to be returned to school the next day. The next morning, the student returns to the check-in room and the whole process begins anew. Over time, a Tier 2 team will be monitoring how well a student is progressing with their implementation of the check-in, check-out process. If the student is not benefiting from the baseline check-in, check-out intervention, the team may look to modify that check-in, check-out procedure based on the student's underlying function of behavior. If check-in, check-out is effective, of course the team would continue with the check-in, check-out and begin planning for a transition to wrap the student back around down to Tier 1 supports only. To do this, we would focus more on the student's own ability to self-regulate and self-manage their behaviors across time, and perhaps even score themselves before phasing them back to a Tier 1 support structure only. If the check-in, check-out is not effective, there are quite a few modifications you could make to the system to better align it with the student's need and the function of their challenging behavior. We will not have time in this module. However, if you click on either of these hyperlinks, you will see additional examples of point sheets, as well as an online module for more information about how to modify the check-in, check-out intervention protocol and process. As a big idea, what we're looking to do with students in this process is move them towards self-management. This involves individuals managing, monitoring, and/or evaluating their own behavior. To do this, we're looking to embed self-management strategies as driven by the data. So as a student has found success with the check-in, check-out procedure, and perhaps we're looking to regulate them more on their own independently and move them back down to a Tier 1 support structure, we might look to have them manage their own check-in, check-out account. You may look to increase the level of prompting in the classroom, using natural signals for them to monitor as much as possible their own behavior. Students may, again, self-monitor their behavioral progress over time. You may even look to have students self-record their behavior and how many points they receive. They might self-award those points when a student, again, has found success with this process. When transitioning the student off of the check-in, check-out point sheet after they've had success for quite some time, if you're looking to have them self-record, in other words, provide themselves their own point totals, you're going to want to initially check for accuracy to make sure the student's giving reliable scores to their behavior over time. Because keep in mind, those point totals will equate to backup reinforcers at the end of each day. Another way to modify the check-in, check-out procedure as a student has found success and is transitioning back to a Tier 1 level of support is you might look to provide fewer checkpoints during the day. So instead of providing a check-in with a teacher at the end of each routine, you may just have an AM and a PM time for the student to check in and check out throughout the day. Again, we are providing more support than the student would receive at the Tier 1 level. However, it's not as intense as the core check-in, check-out procedure, which would be providing check-ins with an adult periodically throughout the school day. Now back to our initial flow chart. So you've requested additional Tier 2 and Tier 3 support. What we're going to do now is look to identify some other Tier 2 support options you might want to consider. Once we've discussed those, Dr. Freeman will take over the conversation, moving us forward in this module to begin discussing Tier 3 tertiary level behavioral supports. At this point, we've identified a targeted group of students displaying frequent but minor challenging behaviors, and we've invested in Tier 2 supports. We've just discussed the check-in, check-out implementation protocol. Another common approach to Tier 2 behavioral supports are social skills groups. You may have some of these in your school today. Social skills training includes direct instruction of appropriate social behavior. Direct instruction includes modeling of appropriate behavior, regular feedback on the student's behavior, and opportunities for the students to practice appropriate behavior in a natural setting. Social skills groups practice features, often include increased positive adult contact, direct social skills training, always has a direct link to school-wide or class-wide behavioral goals and expectations, should include frequent feedback, either daily or weekly feedback, should include increased homeschool communication, as well as positive reinforcement contingent on meeting a goal or a skill-based goal for a student. What does the social skills training process look like? First, what you're going to do as the implementer is identify students and group them based on their target skills. If you have students focusing on different target skills, or if you believe that you have different groups of students whose challenging behaviors function to get or obtain or escape avoid different consequences or outcomes, you're going to want to group those students accordingly. So first you group your students. Then students begin to attend a regular, for instance a weekly, twice a week, 3 times a week, social skills lesson where skills are directly and explicitly taught, practiced, and reinforced by the educator. Through this process, students receive feedback on their behavior from adults in small groups and throughout the day. Target skills and examples for use at home are shared with parents. As a homeschool communication and element of this process, this is critical. So as the implementer, as the educator, or perhaps oftentimes school psychologists may also be leading social skills trainings or lessons with students, critical to communicate with home, to mom, dad, or guardian, identifying what replacement or desired behaviors you're working on with the student and how that might be generalized and implemented at the home as well. You may look at this point to review Module 3 for more information about how to effectively design social skills lesson plans. You might also look to see the Missouri PBIS for more information and tools on teaching Tier 2 social skills. Oftentimes, schools and districts may look to purchase packaged social skills curricula. Some big questions to first ask before making any type of financial investment. First, is it evidence-based? Social skills are often taught through a combination of large group instruction, small skills groups, and individual social skills instruction. Does the program that you are looking into provide this flexibility? Evidence-based social skills programs will always include direct instruction, modeling, role-playing the skill, practicing the skill in different settings, as well as performance feedback. Are all of these types of delivery methods provided or possible in the packaged curricula that you are considering, or that you currently have? Furthermore, performance deficits, skill deficits, and fluency deficits need to be determined when choosing social skills programming for your students. Does the program distinguish between these and provide strategies to address each? And finally, self-management is critical. Self-management without any or minimal cues and prompts is the eventual goal of social skills instruction. Does the program or the package curricula that you're considering or that you currently have lead to effective self-management for your learners? You may look to check out these resources for packaged social skills programs. You may look to see if what you currently have in place is on the list, or if you're looking to pursue purchasing something new. These are both excellent resources. Let's look back now at our organizing slide. So you're looking to request additional Tier 2 or Tier 3 support. As we've talked through so far in this part of the module, you might look to identify whether or not you have students who would benefit best from Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports. If there are individual students displaying chronic or high-intensity behavior problems, they might benefit from Tier 3 supports. Dr. Freeman will move our conversation forward after this piece of this module to discuss what these supports might look like, to identify what the FBA process looks like and how that helps inform an individualized behavior support plan. So far in this module, we've looked and discussed what a check-in, check-out procedure looks like. We've talked about social skills groups. And to wrap up this part of this module, we want to discuss briefly what the class-wide FIT approach is. Class-wide FIT stands for Class-Wide Function-Related Intervention Teams, or FIT. These teams are designed to help students who need more than universal supports. They can be implemented at the class-wide level and intensified for small groups of learners. They incorporate individualized components and supports, and they primarily address attention, which is a common function of problem behaviors for students across the ages. The class-wide FIT model can also be implemented during problem times during the day. At its core, the class-wide FIT model is implemented as a Tier 1 structure, ingraining and embedding many of the support strategies we've discussed through these modules. At the onset, what the educator is looking to do is first to identify class-wide behavioral expectations. At that point, and as we've discussed, a beneficial approach and strategy is to explicitly teach all your learners what those class-wide routines and behaviors are. From there, the educator looks to embed a group contingency system. Oftentimes, through the class-wide FIT model and protocol, the educator will split their group or their classroom into 4 to 6 smaller groups. Each group is then working towards a goal and working with each other through the group contingency. At set intervals of time, every 2 to 4 minutes, the teacher will look at the students, each group of students, and identify whether or not they're exhibiting the target class-wide behavior. If they are, that group will receive recognition and points. Over time, if the group has earned the level of points towards their group goal, they'll receive the backup reinforcer. So, some critical components of the class-wide FIT model. First, explicit teaching. Direct instruction of key social skills. For example, the teacher will instruct the students on how to gain the teacher's attention appropriately, how to follow directions and what following directions looks like across routines, how ignoring inappropriate behaviors as a learner is appropriate, and other optional skills that the educator might look to embed based on the needs of their learning environment. Again, this class-wide FIT model embeds a group contingency system where different student teams compete for points across a school period. Individual students can also look to self-monitor their behaviors across time. Points are awarded every 2 to 5 minutes to groups displaying appropriate behavior, and groups who meet their goal earn that reward and that backup recognition by the educator. As a class-wide FIT model at the Tier 1 level looks to scale up, we look to embed more intense supports for students who are at risk at our Tier 2 level. At this point, as a Tier 2 support, the educator looks to identify the function of the student's challenging behaviors and looks to explicitly teach the student, again, the expected behaviors in the classroom. Through implementing self-management cards at the individual level, students might also benefit from more frequent teacher feedback. So as a Tier 2 support, the class-wide FIT ingrains self-check or self-management cards that the teacher utilizes, as well as help cards. Again, a strategy the students will learn to use appropriately within the classroom instruction period to more readily access the teacher attention or peer attention that they desire. So by implementing help cards, as well as self-management cards at the individual student level, class-wide FIT becomes a readily available and effective Tier 2 support structure. To learn more about the class-wide FIT model and its components, you can see the link listed at the top of your screen. Now, as a brief review, common elements of Tier 2 practices. First, all Tier 2 practices, regardless of the one that you select, should be consistent, and a standardized implementation process across students should be in place. Tier 2 support should also be easily accessible. Students should be able to access these supports within a few days of referral. They're also continuously available and implemented consistently by all school staff. Tier 2 supports are also consistent with and provide extra doses of school-wide expectations and interventions. At the class-wide level, this would be your class-wide expectations. Tier 2 supports will just continually reinforce at a more frequent level what those class-wide expectations are. This is true for behavior and academic supports. Additionally, Tier 2 practices provide targeted and explicit skills instruction, as well as more frequent acknowledgments when students exhibit appropriate behaviors. Tier 2 supports also provide increased adult support, as well as more frequent performance feedback when students exhibit their targeted behaviors. Tier 2 practices should also include plans for how students can generalize and maintain their more appropriate behaviors as they learn them and continue to exhibit them more consistently. Again, as a review, you may be familiar with the taxonomy of intervention intensity. As we've discussed thus far through our options of Tier 2 behavioral supports, what we're effectively looking to do is increase the intensity, the strength, the dosage, as well as the alignment to Tier 1 supports through our Tier 2 practices.